So I'd like to introduce our two speakers for the day, two distinguished speakers and good friends of mine. First, we have Dr. Marla Phillips. Marla leads Xavier University's Health Initiative. She joined Xavier in 2008 as Director of Xavier Health, where she leads the initiatives with both FDA officials and pharma and med device professionals. She's been working in the pharma industry since '96, when she worked for Merck as a senior chemist in the Analytical Methods Development Department. Later, she became manager of Quality Control Lab for the Philadelphia plant site of Merck, and ultimately served as head of Quality Ops for Merck's North Carolina plant. She holds a BS in chemistry from Xavier University and a PhD in organic chemistry from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Our second speaker is Jack Solomon. Jack is the life science practice leader for risks, which includes both supply chain best practices, sourcing, and supply chain risk management. Prior to joining Core Risks, he spent 30 years in industry in both finance and supply chain roles, holding executive level positions with some major pharma companies in both supply chain and procurement. Jack has been involved in Integrity of Supply Initiative for several years and is one of the program co-leaders. He received his bachelor's degree from The Ohio State, as I'm told I have to say, and his MBA from Rutgers University. So with that, I will turn it over to Marla. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks a lot, Andrew. And yeah, as you can hear from my background, coming from Xavier University and University of North Carolina, this NCAA tournament was not kind. So both teams dropping out, with UNC dropping out at the end there. But anyway, we go on. So what I'd like to do with these kind of talks is kind of show you what the end looks like, so you know why we're sharing the background that we're going to share with you. And the other thing too is we have a lot of information to share about the solutions we're developing. So I'm going to go through the background maybe a little bit quickly so that we can get to the meat of what we're developing with the solutions. And so on this slide you can see we're trying to show you that with the end in mind, we're working on developing good supply practices, and we really see the GSPs kind of rounding out the suite of GXPs. And so we're all familiar with good manufacturing practices, importer, distributor, and all of these, you know, you can go on and on, GLP, GCP. So the suite of GXPs are all really geared towards increasing the confidence that we have in our products. And so there's been this gap in addressing the good supply practices, and that's where we're coming in with this work. So with that, as we're developing the good supply practices, we want to have a global home for them so that people can access the work that we're doing. And we have been engaging external stakeholders in the review process, so associations and organizations and specific subject matter experts. We're pulling them in to review the work that we're doing and help own it with us. But then we've also provided a concept paper to ICH, or the International Conference of Harmonization, which houses a lot of documents for the pharma side of the industry. And we are in early discussions for this to be adopted by the World Health Organization. So obviously that would give it a tremendous global platform. Again, our goal is to not do all this work and then hide it under a rock. We want it to be accessible to people. So where we're headed is developing good supply practice documents with real solutions that can be implemented, that are business smart, and focus on the quality, and also have it available to people. So I have 3 slides of the team members, and this initiative started back in 2012. We've had probably over 40 industry and FDA professionals involved with us for 4 years. And so it's been a tremendous amount of work and work continuity. And what I'm going to show you on these 3 slides is that we have a variety of representation. So we have medical device professionals, pharmaceutical professionals, large companies, small companies, suppliers, FDA, vice presidents, engineers, just a whole gamut of representation. And we did that intentionally to make sure that we could look at the problem and then develop the solutions from varying perspectives, and so that we weren't just myopic in our approach. And so I'll point out with FDA, we do have currently on the team Steve Wolfgang, as you can see down here. He's on the team now that we are in solution mode, and that's kind of where his sweet spot is. Prior to that, we had Steve Solomon and Pete Beckerman on board when we were in the discovery mode, and they were very involved in our face-to-face meetings and doing the research and developing the gap analysis with us. So it's just been a tremendous amount of involvement from FDA in this initiative. So we started in 2012 with a problem statement, and it came from two conferences that we have at Xavier, one for the pharma conference, or for the pharma industry, and one for the device industry. And both industries were saying the exact same thing. So we said, hey, why don't we get these two industries together with FDA and see if we can figure out how to overcome this issue. And the issue being, what you're seeing here on the slide is, we kept hearing the professionals in the industry saying, we are unable to reliably and consistently ensure the supply of incoming materials used in products to serve the pharmaceutical and medical device industries. And a lot of this came back when heparin was a big concern, and obviously still is, as well as the vulnerability that we have in our supply chain and risk to criminal activity, and just never knowing if everything you're getting in is what it's supposed to be. So that left an uneasy feeling with both the device and pharma industry. So we said, therefore we need greater assurance that suppliers can reliably and consistently supply safe and quality materials or products to limit adverse impact on end user safety and brand equity. And so what we did is we said, well, let's get together and think through how to make sure that we're on the right track. Because I'll tell you that back at that time, and probably still today really, a lot of the industry is focused on how do we fix, and I put that in quotes, how do we fix the suppliers? If we need them to be able to supply us safe and effective materials the way it's supposed to be, then something must need to be fixed on their end to make sure that they can do this properly. So when we first started, the thought was, well, let's do what the food industry does, and let's certify the suppliers, and then they can be certified to be good enough to supply us. So it sounds pretty vain, and it was. So we said, how about instead of jumping on that, we take a look at what the actual root cause is, and then we'll develop a solution. So what you're seeing on this slide is a process that we went through where we identified the gaps, and again, FDA was involved, pharma, device, and actually food at the time was initially involved with us. So we all looked at what are the gaps in the feeling that we have that we're uneasy about our supply chain. And then we put it through a cause and effect matrix that vetted it against, just because it's a gap, that, what's the significance of that gap. So the cause and effect matrix tool allowed us to really do a Pareto analysis of the ideas and bubble up the most significant issues to the top. And what we found is shown here in the second box is that the data that these manufacturers generated of themselves pointed towards themselves, not their suppliers. And this was a major paradigm shift. Like I said, everything has always been focused on how do we improve the supplier. And this is the first time where we're really looking in the mirror and saying, wow, I have a lot to do with this. And we'll get into that in a minute, but just to give you a glimpse, if you think of worst case, what if you really do have a bad intended supplier in your supply chain? How can we say that that's your fault? Well, my question at the time was, well, who put that supplier in your supply chain? In other words, what system do you have that broke that allowed that supplier to get into your supply chain? So that's when we started really wrapping our heads around this, like, wow, we really do have opportunities here. At that point, we then engaged the suppliers. So they weren't involved initially. We wanted to figure out what the manufacturers were struggling with. We then engaged the suppliers, had a survey and a focus group session, and it really corroborated the findings that the manufacturers had of themselves. And what we had as a result was 3 emerging themes as far as sources of risk, and that related to understanding our own product and process, as well as the material coming into our product and process, the supply chain management, and behaviors. So those are the 3 themes that we focused on. So speaking of those 3 themes, the first one being product and process gaps, what we found was we do not understand our own product and process well enough to do the following, and one being to set the right specifications to begin with. So we're upset when the suppliers can't meet it, but we're not setting the specs right to begin with. The second one showing, that we don't understand the impact of incoming material variability on our product. So how can we know what specifications we need of that incoming material? The third point, looking at identifying proper incoming material testing instead of just relying on compendial testing that exists. Instead of thinking through what do we really need to test functionally and chemically about this material. And then also, we don't understand enough about our own product and process well enough to detect changes in the incoming material and the resulting impact it would have on our final product. Sometimes our specs are wide enough to drive a truck through, so we don't even recognize that something's changed. And those were just some examples. Here's some examples from the supply chain theme that came out, and our systems are not robust. And what we're talking about is, we select suppliers prior to gaining that cross-functional alignment on the requirements and needs that we even have. We qualify suppliers against a limited set of risk elements. So we all do supplier qualification, but it's not very robust, and we'll talk about that later. We do not have a robust change management system in place, internally and across the contract. We do not have quality agreements in place with a large percentage of suppliers, a very large percentage of suppliers, actually, considering how far along we are in that realm of understanding the value of quality agreements. And our order forecast is constantly changing. So again, this introduces opportunity for error at our supplier, and it's something we are doing. And then the last theme is related to behaviors. So we do not behave in a way that engenders trust. We do not assess the amount of risk we are inducing into the process, and so we have to ask ourselves, are we qualified? We are not transparent with our suppliers, but yet we expect them to know what we need. We do not engage suppliers at all, or if so, we're not doing it at the right times, and definitely not on an ongoing basis. It's kind of like that big, initial activity, and then it kind of fades off, and we go about doing other things. We do not view our suppliers as valued experts, and we do not respect the business of our suppliers. Okay, so that's where we then said, okay, let's get some supplier input, and we had a pretty robust response across food, drug, and device. We intentionally chose suppliers that are involved in specialty products where you would be having some of these more important discussions. So what we asked was, we asked the suppliers, what percentage of the time is it critical for you to know the intended use of your product and material? That how is your client going to use your material? I'll just pick one. I'll pick one in the middle here. The way you would read this is 50% of the suppliers said, and you go down here to the grid, greater than 75% of the time, it's critical for me to know the intended use. Okay, so then we said, well, what percentage of your customers actually share their intended use? And what we found was only 45% of the suppliers said greater than 75% of the time do my clients share intended use. And again, remember, these are suppliers involved in specialty type products, not just a transactional PO order. Another interesting piece of information that we found was what percentage of the time are your clients willing to, or are you willing to share your process capability data with your client? So we asked the suppliers, how willing are you to share your process capability data? We found that 45% of the suppliers, again, just picking on the drug pie chart here, said greater than 75% of the time, I'm willing to share my process capability data. Now keep in mind that some of these other percentages are there because they might not be tracking their own process capability data, so they can't share it. So that's part of why the number might be a little bit low. But what we're finding on the next slide is, well, what percentage of your customers actually ask to see your process capability data? Only 27% of the suppliers said greater than 75% of the time do my customers even ask for my process capability data. And isn't that amazing? This tells you the variability of material coming into your product, and we're not even asking for it. Okay, another thing that's interesting is we asked the suppliers, what percentage of the time are you given access to representatives from your customers who have the responsibility, competency, and authority to make decisions? And look at these numbers. Only 23% of the suppliers said greater than 75% of the time, am I even connected to the right people to help me be a good supplier to them? So it's kind of a stark number there. This one's kind of my favorite. What percentage of the time are changes in scheduling from your customer communicated with enough notice and with regard to the commitments you have with other customers? Let's see, 9% of the time, greater than 75% of the time is that scheduling given to me with enough notice. And the food doesn't even have that category as far as greater than 75% of the time. And we know this. I mean, we know that we're constantly changing and the suppliers are killing themselves to make it happen. But do we recognize the opportunity for error that is inducing into their process and the risk it is inducing into the material they are giving us? So what this all led to was this paradigm shift. So in August of 2012, we were thinking our suppliers are causing the problems. How do we certify them? And what we found throughout the winter when we went through all of this analysis was that, well, we are actually causing the problems. And so the key takeaway for us was when we did this disciplined, methodical process, it actually helped us to focus on true root cause.
All right, so here we are as an industry. We're highly regulated. We have lots of policies and procedures. We have extensive training for all of our policies and procedures, but we still have all these problems that Marla's been talking about. So at this point, some things were clear. We really needed something new. We needed something holistic. Early cross-functional involvement, we have to stop paying lip service to that. We really need to do it. We need to balance priorities, stop this situation where the loudest person in the room gets their way. It has to apply to big and small. It has to apply to pharmaceuticals, biotech, and medical devices. So the first thing we did, okay, I'm trying to. All right, the first thing we did was we organized by the types of risks, the sources of these risks. We looked at the supplier-related risks. That's technical capabilities, their compliance, geopolitical risks, the risks of getting the material to your manufacturing site from their location. We looked at product-related risks. How difficult is it to produce? How important is it for the tolerance to be maintained? Is it hazardous material? And then this new concept that, with this paradigm shift, we needed to look at the self-qualification. We needed to look at the risks that we're bringing upon ourselves. Do we include the right people early enough in the process? Are their goals aligned? If we include people early in the process, are they even prepared? In a lot of situations we were seeing, people were embracing cross-functional teams, but they weren't developing people. They weren't training people. They were sending people unprepared, and it didn't work. So they were blaming the process as opposed to the training. What we found was supplier qualification, absolutely not holistic, definitely not robust. In a lot of cases, some of these technical purchases that we're all making, we're sending an individual from the quality organization to do an audit of the CGMP controls without sending technical people, without sending business people, without sending regulatory people. So we're missing a lot there. The self-qualification, in most cases, we're not even looking at that. And when it comes to products and materials, definitely not understood. In most cases, what we're seeing is that companies think that they have to hurry up, and if they hurry up, they don't have the time to do things the right way. So from there, we tried organizing by solutions. And the solutions were based on the type of risk. So we start off by saying, what do we need to do? Well, we need the internal alignment early in the process. When we develop our products, when we determine what materials we need for our products. Once we do that, then we can start talking about what do we need from the supplier. If we know what we need in the material, if we know what we needed to do, then we can start determining what do we need from our suppliers. That's when we should start talking to our suppliers. Now, throughout this process, we're realizing there are a lot of exceptions. In some cases, a supplier will come to you with an idea. So yes, you are talking to them way up front. But for the bulk of the products that we develop or we come up with alternate sources for, we go through this process. So once we've engaged the supplier, once we've talked to them, we're going to pick the suppliers we want to work with. We'll get some samples, or we're going to have them develop a new product for us. Now that we know what we need from our materials, we know the supplier requirements, then we can start the material qualification process and the supplier qualification process. So all of that can happen independent of this self-risk, but that's how we get ourselves into trouble, which is why we've added the self-risk analysis and the self-qualification into the GSP. We also acknowledge the importance of knowledge management and transparency. For something like this to work, we need to understand why decisions were made. a lot of times we get to a certain point in the process and everybody looks, well, who came up with that specification? Why would they do that? Well, if there's documentation, we would understand that and we wouldn't spin our wheels or waste our time, or worse, even change the specifications. So at this point, we had identified problems, we had identified solutions, but we still needed to come up with a sustainable process that people would understand and be able to implement. So in order to convert this to a document, into this guidance that we're developing, we first mapped out a basic flow like we just talked about. The first thing is, the material and product requirements. And again, if it's cross-functional, we can balance the requirements. What we saw was in a lot of cases, people were complaining because the R&D was hurrying up to get it filed. Well, maybe that is justified. Maybe for business reasons, you need to get it out there. Maybe it's a life-saving drug. The sooner you get it out there, the more people you can save, the quicker they can be saved. But if that's the case, and speed is that important, understand what the risks are in making those decisions, in selecting a supplier that may not be the best supplier. In other cases, some of these decisions are just based on an individual's personal goals. And that's why we do build in guidance on how do you align goals? What do you do if somebody's goal is in conflict with what's in the best interests of the company? Again, so we continue that cross-functional involvement through the selection criteria. And part of the selection criteria includes the internal alignment of what should we say to suppliers? Which suppliers should we include? So when we get to the engagement portion, we're able to send a consistent message. Talked about robust supplier qualification. Now that we know what we're looking for, we can do the robust qualification. And this is where we have information on how do you know if you need to send a cross-functional team to a site? How do you know if an on-site audit or even a paper audit is sufficient? And then ultimately, our goal is to commercialize products. And as we do that and we scale up, we start seeing other products and we feed it back into the process. Now, as written, this document would just be sequential, but that's not how the process is. So we need a feedback loop. If during the qualification process we need to change the specification or change the selection criteria, those are going to affect some of the decisions. So we need to make sure that we have the proper feedback loop in there and that people understand what they should be doing. Then we have behaviors, transparency. We need to trust one another within our own organization, and we need transparency across departments. Now, you're not going to have collaboration if we don't have transparency. And the collaboration won't work without alignment. So in the GSP, there's recommendations, there's ideas. What should you do? How can you be doing it? And then there's this group of processes that don't fit in here. They're happening constantly. So one example is supply chain risk management. It's incorporated into every one of these activities, but it's also an activity in and of itself. So we do have guidance and ideas on what you should be doing and how you could be doing it for each of these sections.
Great.
Jack, can you go back one slide real quick? Sorry, Jack and Marla. Can we just go back one slide? I'd just like to make an observation here that's food for thought and perhaps one of the benefits of the GSP. Those 5 items down the right side here, you'll notice that each one of them can be a core competency for a company. Having worked in lots of different firms over the years, and you see very differing levels of maturity in each and every one of those. And I think it really points to the need for this type of process to start giving some discipline and some sort of standard of care to each of those disciplines because it is so important to the patient population.
Yeah, great point, Andrew. And I would point out on this slide too, because those of you on the line, you haven't seen the solutions we're working on. These are just overviews, and you might think it's fluff, but the good thing is I can't stand fluff. And so when we talk about transparency, it's not just, oh, you should be transparent. we're actually getting into what does business smart transparency look like. And there are certain things that we constantly say we can't share, and we're going to challenge that and say, well, what would happen if you did? And if the answer is nothing, and it's just this, this legendary thing that we've carried through our industry for decades without challenging it, then we're going to explore how to share that type of information. And then there will certainly be a list of, well, no, this is information that really should not be shared. So we're really getting into the details and how you can operationally look at this, not just say in general, you should have a more robust supplier qualification or you should be transparent. So it's pretty exciting. So I'll share with you a little bit more in some of the solutions here. So again, along that line, we were talking about this alignment factor. So we're not just saying you need to have internal alignment. We're looking at what tool can we put in place that will help companies understand how to gain that alignment, when to gain the alignment, and to actually keep it alive, keep it living. And so here's just an example. We're really getting into this now. So this is not a final version by any means. It's just kind of getting our thoughts going. But when you look at alignment, you have a few things that you have to align around. So the product specification development, material specification development, supplier selection are just a few examples. And then after that, you have, okay, change to the product, change to the material, change to the supplier. So these are all things that you need to have initially and ongoing. So when we talk about gaining and maintaining alignment, if we look at this alignment tool, first of all, let's define what we even mean by product specification development so we're all on the same page. Who owns that activity typically? So, we might all be involved, but who owns it? What internal stakeholders should be involved? Who should be at the table and when? So, when we're talking about product spec development, it's these functional groups at this time. When we're talking about material spec development, it's those functional groups. And there might be some overlap and there might be some new players at the table. So who are the internal stakeholders that should be involved by functional area? And then supplier engagement. So what do you need to engage your supplier on during product spec development, material spec development, supplier selection? When do you engage them? What do you share with them? That kind of thing. So, I've got this one highlighted because one thing we want to point out is engaging the supplier too early is not healthy either. So if you're not aligned around what you need and you bring the supplier in, it's a lot of wasted time. So you need to make sure that you understand from even your marketing people what's important, or from a supply chain group, or from the product itself. Maybe you geographically need to be co-located because it's temperature sensitive. I mean, there could be a whole host of reasons why you shouldn't just go with the supplier you used for the last product. So get that internal alignment first, so then you can intelligently engage the supplier. And then look at risk evaluations to conduct at these different stages. Critical outcomes, what do you need to be documenting as far as assumptions and decisions, so documenting that knowledge. And transparency, internal and external. What are some things that you should be sharing at this stage that maybe you typically don't think to share? So this is just an example of how deep we're going to go with the solutions, but yet not be prescriptive, saying you have to do this in this way. It provides options and ideas and tools for people to be able to use. So the next one is one that Jack is going to cover on quality agreement.
Okay, so continuing on the theme of trying to help explain what is it that's in this document. Again, it's getting down to a deeper level of information. Using quality agreements as just an example. Quality agreements is one piece of the supplier engagement section. And it's something where there is a lot of information out there already. But for example, if you're buying or selling excipients, you go to the IPEC website and you can see a template for a quality agreement, and you'll see guidance on how to create it. So we first looked at what is the current state, what is the feedback that we're receiving from all these companies, and what we were hearing was that the quality agreement is a quality to quality document, to the point where a lot of other organizations don't know what's in the quality agreement. And in a lot of cases, even incoming inspection, part of the quality organization didn't know what was in there. So for example, if there's a commitment to release material or inspect material within 5 days of receipt, or to notify the supplier within 48 hours of finding a problem, if your lab doesn't know that, you're going to create problems for yourself. There were quite a few respondents who were saying the supply agreement and quality agreement are in conflict. How do you resolve that? And because of some of the problems that were created, a lot of situations suppliers will not sign the quality agreement. So what are we doing? What are we putting into this GSP that's a little different? Well, as we get down to this level of detail in the section on all about quality agreements, we are recommending that it's developed cross-functionally. We're not saying it's not quality to quality. What we're saying is bring in others from the organization, understand what's important. By bringing in maybe R&D or operations, you'll understand what parameters are critical, more important than others, where you can give a little. And it makes the whole document a little bit more holistic. We talk about when to discuss with suppliers. Typically, the quality agreement is that last document you sign after you sign the supply agreement, after you get approval. Now you go back to the supplier and say, oh, by the way, I want a quality agreement. Well, what if they won't let you do an audit? Wouldn't you want to know that right up front? So what we recommend is that very early in the process, you have the conversation with your suppliers. Here's what I want to put in my quality agreement. Here's the terms and conditions. And you need to agree in principle, okay, on what you're going to do. And then we have common concerns and what some of your options are. So, and understanding too that if this isn't always a new product, you have legacy products, you have products you're going to acquire from other companies where you just don't have a quality agreement yet. So what do you do? And what do you do in the situation where the supplier says they will not sign the agreement? Or what if they say you cannot conduct an audit? Well, you need to work with the supplier. And this is another theme that's throughout the GSP is don't just change suppliers. Don't just drop the supplier. Don't just assume they're wrong. Understand why won't you sign my quality agreement? In a lot of cases, it's because of some specific wording or some specific terms. And if you talk about the intent of the document, you're in a better position. Now, you might find too that they can't comply with some of the requirements. But can you help them? Can you help them from a technical perspective? Can you help them from a regulatory perspective? And we're not saying don't change suppliers. What we're saying is work with your supplier. Understand what is the reason they don't want to sign. What is their concern about the document? Because the quality agreement should really just be it's a written document confirming what you've already agreed to. You've established expectations. Another example of what we've put into this document is supply chain risk management. The first step in doing this is identifying and defining the risks. If we don't know what those risks are, we're never going to be able to mitigate them. In this section, like a lot of sections, what we have is some examples of things to look for. What are the types of risks? So for example, where we talk about product risks or supplier risks, we have examples of maybe 20, 30, 40 things to look for. Not saying you should always look at that, but when you're going through your analysis, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Here's some information for you to consider. This next one is interesting, prioritizing products or product lines. Some companies are too big to prioritize by product. So you do it by product line, you do it by market, whatever makes sense for your business. And the typical pushback we get here is, hey, I sell life-saving products. Every one of my products is important. The problem is they don't have the resources to address everything. So if you don't have the resources to address everything, you do need to prioritize. And what we were finding when we did that deeper dive was they are prioritizing. Like for example, pharmaceutical companies, they focus on their large spend or their APIs because typically APIs are the most complex, and you will have a lot of risks associated with that. But what they're doing is ignoring, say, the low spend excipients that's used in every one of their products. In the medical device, there's lots of parts that are coming from the same supplier. Low spend on each one, but in some cases it's critical. I mean that screw may be a custom designed screw, but you're not spending much on it. So you need to determine what the what the impact of these is. So you need to go through each one of once you've determined your priorities, you need to determine what are the what are all the materials that go into these products. Now, you also need to look at suppliers, because a supplier might have a lot of small, low impact items, but when you add them all up, all of a sudden a lot is impacted there. So you want to look at materials and you want to look at suppliers. Once you've done that, you can map out and document your controls, what are your mitigating actions. And again, here's another place where we have lists, we have ideas, things to consider, examples of ways you can do it. And finally, like anything else, you need to monitor and review the changes. So that's not just for the material itself or the supplier, it's also, is this process working? And risks change over time. Priorities change over time. So you need to constantly evaluate the overall process and your allocation of resources.
Great, thank you. And so looking at some of the other solutions as well, we keep mentioning that the supplier qualification today is not very holistic or robust, and it's something that everybody's doing, so it's not a new concept. So the reason we're including this in the Good Supply Practices is to demonstrate how it could become more robust and more business-wide instead of just quality-focused. So what you're seeing here are some common risk elements that are assessed today. And so we take a look at our own history with the supplier, especially if it's someone that we've been using already versus a brand new supplier. And so what has their performance been like for us? What is the compliance of that supplier? Typically, they're not inspected by regulatory authorities, but we could even look at our own audits of them. And then geographical locations, and especially if they're in an area of the world that is under-regulated, what concerns would that raise and risk factors would that include? So we're generally aware of that. And then the risk of the material, so criticality in our product, or if it's temperature sensitive or something like that, we typically look at that. Now, sometimes we don't look at the risk of the material in conjunction with our supplier qualification. It can be sometimes kept separate, so that even though it's up there, it's not always brought into the overall risk score of a supplier. So what's often missing is taking a look at that ingredient or component variability and then the impact that has to the product or the process. Taking a look at geographical location from the viewpoint of supply chain continuity and flow. Capacity, not only today, but in the future. So that would also, of course, require that we would understand what our needs are, or at least have an idea of what we think they are. So going in and seeing if they have the capacity to handle future needs that we have, or if our capacity requires less, will we be at risk of them dropping us? Capability is one that's often not assessed. So how capable are they? And I think it was mentioned earlier that we might send the quality person to go do an audit, but not the technical person. So that's a big miss. And then the financial stability of their company. So again, you don't want to have a supplier in place knowing that it's difficult and costly to change suppliers, only to find out that they were not financially stable. So these are some aspects, and again, this is just a glimpse of some of the ideas that would make the supplier qualification a more robust process. Then we talked about self-qualification. Again, how qualified are we to be in any relationship? If we take a look at how haphazard we can be sometimes and overworked and, not really being able to cross all the T's and dot all the I's. So this is something that's typically not being done today. And so what does that include if we take a look at how do we do a self-qualification? Do we assess our own compliance level? You might actually be in a company where you've been under consent decree recently, or warning letter, or import alerts, or something where you're involved with a compliance issue. What is your own product and process understanding? So is this a brand new therapeutic class for you? Is it something that has technical challenges or requires a tremendous amount of skill in processing the product? How rigorous were your development studies to really test the critical process parameters and the critical quality attributes and understanding what your specs should be? What is the level of cross-functional internal alignment? If we assessed ourselves of that, how good would we be doing against that? What's the adequacy of our own resources? So do we have enough resources to manage the supply chain? What's the stability of our workforce? Do we have constant changes? And now we've got that thought process is leaving, and we're kind of losing track of the tribal knowledge. It's not documented well, and we don't have the stability that we need. And again, that last part, what's the accuracy of order forecast for our suppliers? How often are we changing what we tell the suppliers we need from them? And especially, how often are we making those changes close to the time when we need it? So again, all of this just induces opportunity for error, increases the risk that we get for our own product, and we're part of that. So what I'm showing you here are some ideas, but what's behind this that you're not seeing is we're actually coming up with metrics, things that you can actually measure, and how that would then factor into an overall risk score of yourself. So then on the next slide, what I'll show is, this is pretty cool because you now have a risk score for your supplier and a risk score for yourself. And if you overlay the two, then you have a risk of the relationship, okay? And one way that you can look at that, a tool that we would explore in these good supply practices, is the use of a heat map. So imagine if on the y-axis you take your overall risk score and you plot it on the y-axis, and you plot your supplier's overall risk score on the x-axis, then every point where there's an intersection is the risk of the relationship. So you can tell just by glancing at the heat map where you need to be spending your time and your resources based on the risk. Obviously, if the dots are up higher, it's due to risk that you are inducing. If it's out farther on the x-axis, it's due to risk that your suppliers are inducing. And obviously, anywhere in the middle is joint risk that's being added. So what a great visual to be able to see right away that, okay, these guys are under control. Let me focus up here, or hopefully not way up here. And then keep in mind, too, risk is not always bad, meaning you have a bad supplier. Your supplier might be high risk because the material that they're handling for you is either super critical or even super sensitive. You know, it could be a high risk material. So by that nature alone, it's going to be a higher risk score. So don't always look at this as being bad, but you use this as a tool to understand where do you focus your time and attention and how do you mitigate those risks so that you bring the overall score of the relationship down. Okay, so those are just some of the glimpses of solutions that we're developing. And again, behind this is meat. It's not just, you know, you should be doing this. And so what we wanted to look at next is if you take a look at everything we're developing, what would the value be to the regulators of us developing these good supply practices? And there's two parts to this. One is during the approval and inspection process benefits. So if you take a look at the review, it could provide an approach for question-based review. It would be linked to rigorous supply chain development and confidence, and the rigor of specification development with understanding of incoming material impact and variability. And if you are watching, you know, the latest trends and news, you might realize that Congress just issued a letter to our brand new commissioner insisting that there's more details looking into what happened with heparin. So there's going to be a lot of focus, if not, you know, in addition to what's already there on the supply chain. So now on inspection, if we take a look at what we're developing, it could provide a roadmap for investigators to come in and understand what's going on in the supply chain and how to understand what's in the supply chain. So it gives them a way to ask questions to understand the supplier qualification or your specification effectiveness or the triggers that you have for action in mitigating risk. So it gives them an opportunity to understand, well, where should I even start looking to really know how rigorous the supply chain was developed. So the last thing we wanted to do then is say, well, what would the value be to industry if we develop these good supply practices? And what we're showing is that you would have a better understanding of your product and process, you know, just by, you know, virtue of having this internal alignment alone is going to increase that. But in addition to all the other solutions we're putting together, better understanding of the supply chain, why you have suppliers in your supply chain, what the risk is, what the benefits are, where you need to focus your attention, and how you can maintain it and improve it. And then a better understanding of self, and that piece is pretty much missing. You know, we tend to look outward and want to improve everyone around us. And so overall, it gives this comprehensive risk reduction opportunity and multiple potential other benefits involved as well. But that holistic risk reduction is really the benefit that we see to industry. So where are we with all of this? We have a timeline that we started back in 2012, and believe it or not, this exact slide was developed back in August of 2012, and we are on target with it. So we are in the process now where we identified those themes that we talked about, those 3 areas of focus. We started looking into solution development, and we expanded our team. We started including the suppliers at that point, developing the solutions, and here's where we are today, where we are further developing the solutions. We're going through the internal review process right now, and mid this year we'll be ready for some external review. And then next year what would come is additional external review, taking a look at maybe piloting some of these solutions to see what could be improved or what the benefit was and if it's measurable. So, we just want to kind of end with the thought that when you have a challenge that you're facing, look in the mirror first. And true root cause is critical to meaningful improvement. Can you imagine if back in 2012 we went down the path of certifying our suppliers? First of all, it would take the energy to move a mountain to make that happen. And then what we're finding is it would put a Band-Aid on what's really going on. So look in the mirror first and recognize that it's easier to point your fingers at others, but it's actually easier to fix yourself because you don't have to convince yourself that you need to be fixed. Whereas if we want to fix the suppliers, you'd have to first convince them that they need to be fixed. And good luck with that. So it's easier to fix yourself. So it really does pay off to look in the mirror first. So with that, I will turn it over to Andrew for some questions.
Sure. Well, thanks, Marla and Jack. I thought that was very interesting. I have received a couple questions in, and let me ask one that's sort of a 2-part question combining 2 things. So one, as these GSPs are developed and the process is expanded, how do you see that being rolled out to global industry so that they'll be aware of it? And then sort of a second part to that question is, have the members of the group talked about how, when we are implementing this, how do we start thinking about maturing both the supply agreements and the quality agreements so that we're actually able to build this type of awareness and assessment into those? Often companies hate to change quality agreements, and it becomes a whole negotiation challenge. So maybe you can kind of tackle those 2 things together.
Okay, I'll take the first part, and then Jack, if you want to take the second part, since you were talking about the quality agreements earlier. So the first part, getting that global awareness, is what I was trying to address a little bit earlier. Ever since we started, I was kind of trying to picture, I don't want to go through all this work with this team of dedicated people and then just have it sit in a drawer. So ICH would be a great platform on the pharma side where regulators actually recognize that and can inspect against it from the standpoint of expectations. You can't be written up against it, but it provides expectations. So that would be tremendous awareness. On the device side, they used to have the Global Harmonization Task Force, which was similar to ICH, but that's been disbanded. And so that's where discussions about the World Health Organization have come into play, and possibly partnering with another organization to make that happen. And there's a very, very real possibility that could happen. And then surround it with a suite of training and additional understanding to help companies implement this. So that's our hope, that this does get this global awareness. But I'll turn it over to Jack for the second part.
All right, so the second question, or the second part, was we have supply agreements and quality agreements that conflict, but people don't want to reopen them. I guess it's you need to do a risk-based analysis like anything else and determine first, well, what are the differences? What if we don't change them? How significant is it? But the fact that so many people responded during the early stages of this project and said that they're in conflict would indicate to me that we've probably got some significant differences in there. And if there are significant differences, you really do need to resolve them and maybe understand, why don't we want to open up a quality agreement for amendments? And then you have to weigh the pros and the cons, because you're setting yourself up for exposure unnecessarily.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, Andrew, I think I heard too you mentioning the maturity. So how would we mature as an industry as it relates to those agreements? And so part of that would be to put guidance in this document as far as what to consider in the quality agreements. So we're not going to be extremely prescriptive saying you have to do it this way. Maturity would be not only on a company basis where you're looking at a much more operational approach to using the quality agreement instead of, okay, we've got the quality agreement in place, let's check the box and put it in the drawer, but actually using it operationally. But then as an industry maturing to the point where we could actually come up with a standardized form that it's just tweaked a little bit for specific cases, but we have not been able to do that as an industry for a number of reasons that mostly boil down to convenience and legal preferences, really. So there is potential, both for companies and as an industry.
Okay, and just, I guess, a question to you both as an observation from me, but maybe you can go a bit. I'm seeing this as sort of a maturization of the process that seems to be beneficial to both sides, the supplier and the supplyee. Is the group thinking that that's something that's going to, sort of help both sides of it in order to help the consumer?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yes. I mean, the suppliers who are involved in the initiative are just extremely excited about working with the manufacturers, and the manufacturers have just been really excited to have the suppliers involved. So we're not just kind of kidding ourselves saying, oh, this will fix everything. We actually have the suppliers right there saying, this will actually make a difference. And so both sides are seeing that. But Jack, I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And some of the things that are happening, behind the scenes, we are having sessions with suppliers, trying to, sharing this with them and understanding what their concerns, criticisms are. And more importantly, I mean, some of this is why haven't companies changed? And because some of it is so basic and so obvious, but in a lot of cases, we put it back to the suppliers to say, well, why haven't you changed? Because a lot of this applies to the suppliers themselves and how they deal with their suppliers. So we are having, again, the work sessions that we're having, the focus groups that we're having with some suppliers is helping with that and helping with the development of the GSP itself.
Okay. But it seems to me as an observation that this is letting us, by building the risk-based approach, it's changing the value proposition and the discussion to not just be who's the cheapest, but what are all the parameters involved, and how are we appropriately pricing, for the right level of protection, the right level of engagement from both the supplier and maybe increasing the relationship to make it more of a win-win is sort of what I'm seeing.
Absolutely. And again, we do acknowledge the fact that there's different types of relationships. But definitely as you get into your more strategic relationships, you really want a win-win. I think some of the pushback we've had is, well, wait, if I give too much business to one supplier, what if they take advantage of me? Well, if you have a true strategic relationship, it should benefit both companies. So if you have for instance, if your supplier is helping you launch new products quicker and your revenue is, growing beyond what you even expected, that's the kind of relationship you're looking for, and you shouldn't worry about having to pay a little bit more.
Right.
Yeah, and Jack, you said something really important there that I don't think we pointed out earlier, is everything that we're doing is with the thought that it has to be commensurate with the need. So we don't even say you need to improve quality, because, in some cases you don't. And so it has to be commensurate with the need. It has to be business smart. And so we don't say this is what you need to do for every supplier you have. Everything is based on risk assessment and where should you be spending your time. But we also recognize that like heparin, for example, or some of the other contaminated product issues that have come out, whether it was in food or even pet food or drugs, it would have been the material that was the least risk material, and people would not have caught it just by using risk grid. So we do address all of that in these solutions.
Excellent. Okay, well, with that, I think that brings us just about to the end of our hour. I don't see any additional questions recently coming in. We will be posting this this webinar, a recording of it for people's reference and for sharing if your colleagues are not able to join us today. And we will send out information on where to get that link so that you can open it up at your convenience. If there are any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact Jack or Marla directly. And with that, I think we wish you all a good day, and hopefully the snow melts for those who are in places with snow.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.